welcome, Tobias. Hope you're well.
Good, thanks.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, so um, firstly, just to say thank you for taking the time to join us today. The purpose of today's interview with you is very much kind of linked to the ongoing Disability History Month campaign that RCVS and BCVIS have been working on together in collaboration. And so what I'm going to do is literally just go through um, some questions to get a bit more of an understanding about your experiences. And so I'll go straight into the first one, which is about um, your background. So can you give
Yes.
us an insight into your background and what inspired you to go into the veterinary profession?
Yep, sure. I am a final year vet student, so I'm graduating this year. I'm one of those classic people that kind of wanted to be a vet as long as I can remember. So ever since like primary school, when I was like 5 years old, I was always wanted to be a vet. Um, I'd say so. I grew up kind of next to a council estate in Brighton. Um, So obviously kind of a city urban type environment, not near any kind of farms or horses or anything like that. But I always used to visit like zoos whenever we were out on a trip. That was kind of my
Hmm.
favorite place to be. So just kind of that love of animals really just got me into being a vet. I also just like kind of like logic and problem solving, which I think is obviously quite important in veterinary. So just trying to work out, like put all the pieces together, work out what's wrong with the animal, things like that.
Hmm. 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 Excellent. Thank you so much. Um, and what were the key moments that kind of set in your path? I mean, you've spoken a little bit about, just when you were younger, going to zoos and how that, obviously gave you some inspiration. But thinking about the journey you've been on so far, what do you think have been the key moments that have helped to
Um,
set you on this path?
yeah, so I it's quite a difficult question because as I said, I don't remember ever wanting to do anything else. So it was more kind
Mm,
of things that kind of signified I was in the right path. Um, so like doing my work experience with vet school, like seeing what it is the vets actually did on the day to day, all of that obviously kind of confirmed that I was going into the right profession for me.
sure.
Um, Throughout vet school, again, kind of the clinical EMS I've done has been what's kind of reminded me why I'm here. I'm not a lecture person. I haven't enjoyed vet school as much as some other people, and I think that is down to being neurodivergent. But we can obviously talk about that later. Um, but the when I go back out on placement and I'm reminded of kind of why I'm here,
Mm,
um, when I'm at work as well. So I work in a small animal hospital. So when you're able to kind of make that impact for owners and kind of see like the actual real life effects, like, either saving the animal, giving them a peaceful passing, all of that, that kind of reminds me that I am in the right profession, even
mm,
if the
mm.
education side of things has not been as great.
Yeah, sure, sure. That's fair enough. And I guess yeah, it is interesting that, as you say, you've always wanted to be um doing what you're doing. Um and it's nice to hear that you've had some kind of reaffirming, moments that have almost kind of validated your desire to be a vet.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. Okay. So can you share some details? Can you tell us more about your neurodivergence and how this has impacted your journey through vet school?
Yeah. So I am autistic and have ADHD. Both of those were kind of diagnosed when I was an adult-ish, so autistic. I was diagnosed at 18. ADHD, I was diagnosed not this September, but the last. So both were kind of not through childhood, basically. Um, I'd say I think what I kind of noticed in terms of challenges, really, for kind of the autistic side, was kind of the social communication aspect. But it's not communication with clients, which is what think some people kind of think about. It's more communication with like colleagues or in particular staff members at the university.
Mm,
So I had quite a few instances of being told I come off quite rude, especially over emails, which is obviously quite upsetting because I'm not meant to be rude, but it is obviously just kind of a miscommunication. And then the other side of things I'd say would be um, things like exam questions, where I really struggle to interpret what it actually is they're asking me.
mm,
I think written questions, because they get kind of looked over so much and reviewed, aren't always as bad, but it's particularly oral exams where obviously no one's kind of thinking about how they're asking the questions. They ask it in a way that is kind of very open-ended, and
mm,
I'm not able to interpret that at all, basically.
mm,
So I really struggle with oral exams for that reason.
mm,
Um, but I guess what I then kind of noticed, and what prompted me to go for my ADHD diagnosis was then the issues I noticed with kind of focusing during uni. So I've mentioned I'm not a lecture person because I will zone out after 5-10 minutes of the lecture. And it would get to the point where still went to lectures, but I just put my earbuds in and just do something else instead
mm,
because I just couldn't focus on the actual lecturer.
mhm,
Obviously, that varies depending on the lecturer's like style of teaching, how kind of engaging and interactive they are. But it basically just meant I just could not learn anything from lectures. I can only learn from kind of practicals or placements, basically. And then that kind of really, uh, really made a difference when it came to revision for exams, because you then lose any kind of structure and you just have to try and make your own structure, which for any ADHD person will tell you is not great. um, so I just could not revise. I just could not get myself to concentrate for longer than 5-10 minutes.
mm,
Um, so that is what I'd say has kind of made vet school, at least the preclinical side, a lot more challenging.
mm.
Um, and now
And
in rotations it is
and
better because you're more
mm,
practical aspect, but it definitely made preclinical a lot harder.
yeah, sure. And were there not any sort of reasonable adjustments that they were able to make at university to accommodate that?
Not not really. So when it comes to the kind of reasonable adjustments for preclinical, it tends to be very exam orientated. So as
Mm,
in, I can get rest breaks in the exam to help me with kind of concentration throughout the exam, but that's not going to help with kind of the revision periods or the whole year of lectures leading up to it, if that makes sense.
hmm
Um, so yeah, again in rotations they have made some kind of um, some more adjustments in that regards, like being able to uh, so I can leave during certain sessions if I'm not paying it. If I'm not able to kind of concentrate, I can record certain sessions so that I can look back at it later if I'm not able to kind of make notes at the time, things like that.
Sure. Okay.
But yeah, during lectures and kind of the preclinical side of things, it tends to be kind of you just have to deal with the timetable basically.
Mm, yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, that's interesting and also really insightful. So I guess, that's something for universities to also think about and, consider in future, right? 'Cause, I'm
Yeah.
sure there's things that can be done, hopefully, to improve that. Okay. So how have you managed those challenges? What are some of the like, sort of coping strategies, if you like, that you've been able to implement that you feel have helped you along the way to keep you on the path that you're on?
Yeah. So, in terms of kind of the misunderstandings I've had about communication, I am now just very kind of open and upfront about being autistic. So you might have noticed when we were emailing, I have it in my email signature that I'm
Mm,
autistic, and that anything I say, please kind of just interpret it with good intentions, and so on. Just like assume I'm well meant, basically.
yeah, yeah.
And I've also started in our rotations, we have them in little groups. So I just flag it to the rest of my group at the start of rotations. So that again, if you ever think I'm being rude, just kind of remember that I am autistic and that I'm probably just being more blunt than needed. And if
Mm,
anyone has an issue, to just kind of come up to me and say so rather than kind of letting it fester or anything like that. Because it's usually something we can resolve quite easily.
mm,
Um, in terms of kind of the ADHD and like more focus side of things, I use alarms a lot. So I set an alarm 5 minutes before this meeting to jump on.
hmm
Um, and I will do that no matter what I'm doing. Like I won't sit down to do something until I've set an alarm for what I have to do next. So that way, if I do end up in like a hyper focused situation, I won't miss what I'm meant to attend. And I basically just kind of let my calendar run my life. So everything is planned out. So I always know what I'm doing, basically. Um,
hmm
in terms of trying to get myself to focus on certain tasks, that is kind of the harder thing where, like, say I need to revise a certain task, it is a struggle to sit down and just do it.
mm,
So again, I try and give myself kind of as much time beforehand as possible. So if I need to get something done in 2 weeks' time, I'll tell myself it has to be done in 1 week's time. And then by the time I'm actually able to do it, it probably will be the 2 weeks, if that makes sense. So just
hmm
kind of
hmm
like earlier deadlines, basically, to try and avoid the kind of last minute all-nighter.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but
And,
yeah.
and how do you think, just on that point then, I mean, how do you think that has translated into the working environment that you're in now? Because I appreciate that, obviously the examples you've given are, you know, probably more specific to your revision and your uni work, but then when you're actually working, in a practice, have you been able to adopt some of those same strategies as well, or have there been some differences?
Yeah, so I would say it is a bit different, and this seems to be common to quite a few like neurodivergent people. Is it is a bit different doing stuff at work versus doing it kind of at home? Is you tend it's like for ADHD, it tends to be easier to focus on things, and just to get certain tasks done. Um, whereas once you go home, you kind of switch off, and then that's it. You're like done for the day, and then you struggle to do kind of the self-care tasks. So for work, I still utilize things like timers, and having like a good calendar, like diary management system, and also just lots of to-do lists. So I always know what needs to be done. Um, so if there's a certain task someone wants me to do, I'd rather they sent it to me as like a memo, so I had like a record of it rather than just tell me verbally.
Mhm.
Um, and if they don't send it as a memo, I will make myself a task for it so that, like I said, it won't get lost, so I won't forget to do it.
Mm,
Um, and a lot of autistic people will always have little scripts, which I have for pretty much every phone call I have to do, or every consult. I'll have like a little script of how it's meant to start,
mm,
um, and that will just help with kind of the social communication aspect. Obviously, the script will vary, but if you just have like an idea of kind of just some phrases that you can use if you can't think of anything else, like how cute the dog is and things like that, then it just helps with kind of that aspect.
mm. No, that's great. That's great. And it's good to kind of understand more about, how there are some similarities and also some nuances, between sort of your uni life and your work as well. So that's great. Um, what do you consider to be um, the positive aspects of being neurodivergent within the workplace?
Yeah. So what I think is, I mean, me personally, I'd say my kind of biggest strength is the ability to memorize a lot of very specific details. So I'm quite good at numbers, so I can memorize kind of the numbers on a blood test result like instantly without trying, basically. It just sticks in my head. Um, Once I read like some bits of information again, it just sticks in the head. So it's very good for kind of reading through a history and just picking out the key details, and then they're just stuck in my head during the actual consult, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and so that is obviously coming useful for, as I said, for like history taking and like the consult aspects. Um, what I would say in kind of general kind of workplace team sense is a lot of ND individuals basically tend to be kind of have better awareness of their strengths and limitations because obviously they've been coping with them their whole life. So they've been coming
Mm.
up with kind of different coping mechanisms. They've been having to adapt to systems and structures that are not built for them.
Mhm.
So they basically have a better understanding of how they best learn, how they best work, what kind of environment would suit them. Whereas someone who obviously hasn't faced those challenges might not realize it until they obviously have to face a challenge.
Mhm.
Um, and although we're people come to sometimes tease us as being unable to adapt to certain things, I think we're actually better at adapting in that way. So, like I said, we've had to learn to cope with things that aren't set up for us.
Mm.
So we are better at kind of finding a way around it or finding a way that works for us. And then the one thing that I think people really kind of forget about is we have neurodivergent clients as well.
Mm.
So if that autistic client comes in, then we are going to bond a lot. And that is a really good way to kind of make sure you're catering for all your clients' needs is to have ND staff
Mm.
because then
Mm.
they know what the client's needs are going to be. They're able to kind of bond with them over their special interest, all that kind of thing, and just think about things to adapt the practice for that the neurotypical staff probably won't think about. So things like
Sure.
lighting in the waiting room is usually very bright, which is not great for neurodivergent people. So yeah, they'll have ideas like that that you won't think about until you have an ND member of staff.
Great. No, that's really good. And I want to kind of go back to a point that you made earlier about neurodivergent people being more aware of their strengths and limitations. And I wanted to kind of just understand a bit more about how you develop that self-awareness of your strengths and limitations. When do you think it actually started to kind of, come to play, so to speak?
Yeah. Okay. So I would say it was probably around this time. I think so. Basically, I was diagnosed as autistic before I kind of thought about the fact that I could be autistic. It was kind of like suggested, and I went for the diagnosis, and I was like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But before that, I'd obviously gone through kind of secondary school and sixth form and all of that without knowing I was autistic at all. Um, and I just learned ways to kind of cope in terms of like social situations, or cope with lack of structure. Um, I could tell that something was wrong, like not wrong. Something was different about me. I
Mm.
could I could tell that there was a way that the other people were able to understand or interpret what was going on that I couldn't. But I just learned ways to kind of adapt that. So I made up my own rules. So I said if so instead of trying to work out kind of the context behind what someone said, I learnt if someone says this, it could mean A, B, or C. Um, and then learn to read like human behavior to just try and work out, is it the sarcastic response? Is it the genuine response, etc.
Hmm.
So I'd basically developed kind of all my own systems before I even knew why I was developing those systems. It was just something I had to do to kind of get through school. Um, and like I said, it ended up being kind of a lot of strengths in terms of I memorized the mark schemes instead of actually paying attention in the lessons. Um, because I realized that was the way you passed exams.
Mm,
Um, so there are kind of a lot of strengths, but it did take a lot of effort in terms of the social side of things, like having to come up with all those systems instead of just being able to just understand what someone is saying. Um, so yeah, I think you just like I said, you just start facing these challenges in everyday life that everyone else seems to find so easy. So obviously you're finding a way to adapt to it. And by that you learn, do I prefer it better when it's noisy outside or when it's quiet outside? Or do I need that perfect level of just a little bit of noise so it's not too quiet, but not enough noise so it isn't overwhelming?
mhm.
And you just learn that way what works for you. Whereas people who've never had to think about what level of noise there is obviously aren't going to know that.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I don't think you realize until you realize that you're neurodivergent why you're doing it. I think everyone does have to learn kind of their strengths and limitations to basically make their way through the world.
Sure, sure, sure. Great, thank you. So, looking back to when you first started um, vet school, and where you are now on your journey as a final year kind of student, um, how do you feel conversations around neurodivergency and disability within the vet profession has evolved during that period of time? What are your thoughts on that?
So I'd say there's a lot more kind of awareness in general of people being neurodiverse or neurodivergent. Um, there's definitely a lot more conversations about it as well. So obviously, BSAVA had a neurodiversity stream in their Congress, which is kind of a big
Mhm,
deal. Um, in terms of disability, we obviously also had the kind of discussions around limited licensure with the RCVS kind of coming out into the public as well. So there's
mhm,
been a lot more conversations about it. I'm not convinced there's been a lot more change. I still think we're just in that discussion aspect where we're just talking about things rather than actually fixing things.
mhm,
But hopefully that will come with kind of more awareness, and also realizing just how many of the profession are neurodivergent, because it is quite a lot.
mm, mm,
I am actually doing a research project at the moment on, we surveyed neurodivergent students at Liverpool, Nottingham, and Surrey,
mhm,
to try and get an idea of kind of how many there were.
mhm,
I'm basically analyzing the data right now. But we did get over, I think it was over 130 responses across the three unis, and that's just obviously in the students,
mm,
um, not counting for the rest of the profession that are out there. Um, so I think people just don't realize kind of how common it actually is. Um, but there are workplaces that are definitely making kind of adjustments, and that are definitely being like accommodating in that respect. I think the vet schools still have quite a bit to go, um, and they seem to be a lot slower to change, I'd say.
mm, mm. So yeah, I guess you've kind of got those sort of things that are almost kind of happening in parallel. So you've got the awareness conversations piece, which is an ongoing thing. But then actually there's the action
Yeah,
that is starting to happen, but perhaps not as quickly as you'd like. And that also needs to keep sort of moving forwards as well. Is that a fair
yeah,
summary?
yeah. I think
Great,
that's a good summary.
thank you. Okay, excellent. So, um, in your opinion, how do you how do you create a working environment where people with neurodivergency can thrive? And you've already talked a little bit about some things that could be done. So you talked about the lighting, for example, earlier on. So obviously that's one aspect of design of the environment that could be changed. That could be
Yeah.
a big help. But what are the other things that you think are really important in a workplace environment that can help neurodivergent people thrive?
Yeah. So, um, basically, it is certainly possible. And I think the main thing that someone needs to be able to do if they want to employ neurodivergent people that thrive is to be willing to adapt. So basically, just be willing to be flexible about kind of every aspect of your work in terms of if you've usually worked 9 to 5, that doesn't mean everyone has to. They can work longer hours, they can work shorter hours, they can work weekends versus weekdays. All of those are kind of being able to be flexible in all of those means you're going to be able to suit different people. One person might prefer voice notes, one person might prefer text, one person might prefer emails, etc. Being willing to switch from like Teams to Zoom because some have the different softwares have different capabilities. Some work with captions better than others, etc. All that kind of thing, like being able to switch between phone calls to video meetings to emails. Just is the more flexible you are, the more you're going to be able to kind of accommodate everyone's needs. And there obviously will be sometimes where like the two individuals' needs kind of clash a little bit. So you can obviously work towards meeting them at least halfway. But if you also develop kind of basically that team culture where everyone can ask for what they need. So people aren't afraid to say, actually, the light's a little too bright in this room. Can I turn it down? Or actually, I don't think I can handle a Zoom meeting today. Could we do an email instead, etc. Like if they're just able to kind of voice their needs that way and not kind of feel like they're being a problem or a burden, then obviously they're gonna voice their needs all the time, and then their needs will actually be met, and then they'll thrive. And so yeah, basically the two things is basically being willing to adapt and basically having that open team culture where everyone can kind of ask for what they want and actually have their needs met rather than just kind of suffering in silence.
Sure. So that's great. That's great. And I think that, depending on the organization, um, they might be at a sort of beginning of their journey where they're trying to figure out like, how do we do this? How do we create that environment where neurodivergent people can thrive? And I think for those organizations who are at the start of their journey, what do you think is the one thing that they should start with first in terms of creating that environment of thriving? Is there one
That's a
thing
good
that they
question.
can start with?
I think if they just start with an open dialogue, so it's in literally just have an open discussion with whoever they're recruiting or their first employees if they've already got them, and just say what is it that you want in this workplace? Like what would best suit you? Do you want more chairs? What hours would best suit you? How do you want to have meetings like in person, on Teams, all of that? Like basically just ask those questions
Mhm.
and then just make it a regular thing. So have like a regular check-in, once a month or whatever, where you just assess what's working, what isn't. It's separate to like clinical audits and all of that, like just a meeting where it's just about the actual workplace and the way things run. So we did like a 6 month check-in after we'd been up and running for 6 months about how we were communicating, how we were assigning tasks, and whether that worked for everybody. Just to kind of assess that rather than just letting people struggle. But yeah, basically just having that kind of open dialogue that from the beginning, and
Mm.
that's the best way to set yourself up for success.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you for that. Which then kind of brings me on to my next question, which is, I guess, similar to a certain point, and that is about fostering a culture of belonging. So we've talked about thriving, but thinking about belonging and how neurodivergent people can have that sort of feeling, and what the vet profession can do in terms of approaches they can take.
Yeah. So when we talk about belonging, what we basically want is to feel like we're not the different people.
Mm-hmm.
So what we essentially need to move towards as a profession is not looking at it as like one side is normal, and then these are all the different awkward people. We need to kind of get to a point where we realize that both being neurotypical and neurodivergent has its like strengths and limitations. But what we need is to understand that both need to be willing to be flexible and to adapt. So obviously we have needs that need to be met. But often it's looked as though we're the people that have a problem communicating. Whereas I think personally that neurotypicals struggle with communication a lot because they never say what they mean. So basically, you just need to kind of get to that point where both parties understand that, as I said, they've both got ways they want to work, and then you basically have to meet in the middle.
Mm.
So it's always a two-way street, basically. So when I'm talking about asking like the whole team, what ways both best suit them, I'm talking about asking the whole team, not just
Mm-hmm.
the neurodivergent people.
Mm-hmm.
But again, the neurotypical people start to understand. Actually, I might prefer it if we had the lighting down a notch. And they start to realize actually some of the things that benefit neurodivergent people are going to benefit everyone. So we would all prefer if there wasn't a screaming dog in kennels all day long. Um, so maybe we would all like to have noise cancelling headphones at work, etc., etc. So it's basically just getting to that idea of like we can actually adapt for everyone, not just neurodivergent people. The best thing is to work out what you need. So work out how you think best, how you study best, work out what you need. So do you need to make mind maps? Do you need flashcards? Do you need to are you like a verbal processor, etc.? Like work out what works best for you. And then advocate for that. So
Mm-hmm.
if they won't get, if they won't give you kind of recordings to your lectures, which most unis do, then you explain that that's what you need as part of your accommodations. If you need to make mind maps, don't listen to the one lecturer that is obsessed with flashcards. Just do what works best for you, basically. Yeah.
Great. No, that's great. Thank you very much. So when we're now coming towards the end of the interview, and I just wanted to take this opportunity, I guess, to kind of just pause and reflect on all the various things that we've discussed today, and whether you have any sort of final sort of takeaway messages that you would like to leave with the audience who are going to watch this interview.
So as I said before, if we move towards kind of that open team culture where everyone can just state what they need when they need it, then we're going to accommodate kind of everyone's needs. And then we won't have to worry about disclosing our private medical information to get what we need.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure listening to you and your responses to the question. Yeah, thank you.
No worries. Thanks for having me.